I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but after 4 years, I still can't shake the memories of what happened that night in Portland. I was 22 then, fresh out of college and working my first real job as a junior photographer for a local magazine. Like many people my age, I had developed an obsession with urban exploration, spending my weekends documenting abandoned buildings and forgotten places around the city. My story begins in late October 2020, during the height of the pandemic, when the city felt like a ghost town. Most businesses were shuttered, streets were empty, and the usual bustling nightlife had ground to a halt. For someone like me who thrived on exploring urban ruins, it was actually an ideal time. Security was more lax, and there were fewer people around to question what I was doing. I had been dating Emma for about 3 months. She was an art student at Portland State University, and unlike my previous girlfriends, she shared my fascination with abandoned places. We had done several small explorations together, mostly vacant buildings and old industrial sites. But I had something bigger in mind for that particular night: the Shanghai Tunnels. For those unfamiliar with Portland's history, the Shanghai Tunnels are a network of underground passages that run beneath the Old Town district. They were allegedly used in the late 1800s for Shanghaiing, the practice of kidnapping men to serve as crew members on ships. While parts of the tunnels are now tourist attractions, there are supposedly many unmapped sections that remain sealed off from the public. I had discovered what I believed to be an entrance to one of these unopened sections behind an old restaurant that had closed down during the pandemic. The place had been boarded up for months, and I'd noticed a suspicious-looking cellar door during one of my reconnaissance walks. It took some convincing, but Emma eventually agreed to explore it with me at midnight, when we'd be less likely to draw attention. The night was unusually cold for October, with a thick fog rolling in from the Willamette River. The empty streets amplified every sound, our footsteps echoing off brick walls, the distant wail of sirens, the occasional rattle of the MAX train crossing the steel bridge. We parked several blocks away and approached the restaurant on foot, keeping to the shadows. "Are you sure about this?" Emma whispered as I worked on the padlock securing the cellar door. I had gotten pretty good at picking basic locks over the years, not something I'm proud of, but a useful skill in urban exploration. "Trust me," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I've done plenty of research. These tunnels are supposedly full of artifacts from Portland's history. It'll be worth it." The lock finally clicked open, and we slipped inside, closing the door behind us. The beam from my flashlight revealed a steep set of stairs descending into darkness. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and old wood. Emma gripped my hand tightly as we made our way down. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in what appeared to be an old storage room. Wooden shelves lined the walls, still holding ancient-looking bottles and cans covered in decades of dust. But what caught my attention was a narrow archway in the far corner, partially concealed behind fallen debris. This had to be the entrance to the tunnels. We carefully made our way through the archway and found ourselves in a long corridor that stretched into darkness in both directions. The walls were made of rough-hewn stone, and ancient pipes ran along the ceiling. The floor was uneven, covered in a mixture of dirt and broken bricks. The air felt heavier down here, and our flashlight beams seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. "Which way?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I consulted the rough map I'd drawn based on my research. "Left should take us toward the river. That's where most of the interesting stuff is supposed to be." We walked slowly, documenting everything with our cameras. The tunnel occasionally branched off into smaller passages, but we stuck to the main route. The silence was absolute except for the occasional drip of water and our own footsteps. After about 15 minutes of walking, we came across something interesting: an old wooden door set into the wall. The door was partially rotted but still intact. It took both of us pushing against it to get it open. Inside, we found what looked like an old bar room. There was a long wooden bar against one wall, complete with an ornate mirror behind it, though most of the glass was now missing. Broken chairs and tables were scattered about, and old newspapers covered the floor. "This is incredible," Emma breathed, snapping pictures. "It's like stepping back in time." I was examining some of the old bottles behind the bar when we heard it. A sound that made both of us freeze in place. It was music, but not like anything I'd ever heard before. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere deep in the tunnels. A strange, discordant melody played on what sounded like a violin, but somehow wrong, as if the instrument was out of tune or the strings were made of something that shouldn't be used for making music. "Please tell me you hear that too," Emma whispered, clutching my arm. I nodded, unable to find my voice for a moment. The music was getting louder, and with it came another sound, something that sounded like footsteps, but not quite. It was more like a shuffling, dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor. We switched off our flashlights instinctively, plunging ourselves into complete darkness. The only light now came from the faint glow of Emma's camera screen. The music was getting closer, and I could now make out more details of the melody. It seemed to follow no particular pattern, jumping between high-pitched screeches and low, rumbling notes that seemed to vibrate in my chest. Then we saw the light, a sickly, greenish glow that began to illuminate the tunnel outside the bar room. It moved like candlelight, but was completely wrong in color. The shuffling sounds were now clearly coming from the same direction as the light and the music. Emma was shaking beside me, and I could feel my own heart pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there would hear it. We crouched behind the bar, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. The green light grew stronger, and the music reached a crescendo that made my teeth ache. Through a gap in the rotted wood of the bar, I could see into the tunnel. What I saw made no sense then, and makes no sense now. The light seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere at once, casting strange shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't, and in the middle of it all was something. I can't accurately describe what I saw. My mind seems to slip away from the memory every time I try to focus on it. It was roughly human-shaped, but too tall, too thin, and it moved in a way that violated everything I know about how bodies are supposed to move. The violin, if that's what it was, seemed to be part of it rather than something it was holding. The thing paused outside the barroom door. The music stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound like dozens of whispers, all speaking at once in a language I couldn't understand. I felt Emma's hand tighten on my arm, her nails digging into my skin. We both held our breath, neither of us daring to move a muscle. For what felt like an eternity, the thing stood there, its impossible form swaying slightly in the green light. Then, slowly, its head began to turn toward the barroom door. I caught a glimpse of something that might have been a face, and my mind simply refused to process what I was seeing. Before it could turn completely toward us, there was a distant crash from somewhere in the tunnels, like metal falling on stone. The thing's head snapped toward the sound with a movement too quick to follow. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, and then, in a burst of that sickly green light, it was gone, taking the music with it. We waited in the darkness for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, neither of us daring to move or speak. Finally, when the silence had stretched on long enough that I was starting to hear phantom sounds in the darkness, I whispered, "We need to get out of here." Emma nodded frantically, and we both stood on shaky legs. I switched on my flashlight, half expecting to see the thing standing right in front of us, but the beam revealed only the empty barroom. We made our way back to the tunnel, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. The return journey was a nightmare. Every shadow seemed to move, and every sound made us jump. We took a wrong turn at least once, ending up in a dead end that looked nothing like anything we'd passed on our way in. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe, and there was a constant sensation of being watched. When we finally emerged from the cellar into the fog-shrouded street, we ran all the way back to my car without stopping. It wasn't until we were several miles away, sitting in a well-lit parking lot, that we finally spoke about what had happened. What was that thing?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. I shook my head. "I don't know. I don't want to know." We spent hours that night trying to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was someone playing an elaborate prank. Maybe the strange movements and impossible form were tricks of the light and shadows. Maybe the green glow was some sort of bioluminescent fungus. Maybe the music was just coming from somewhere above ground, distorted by the tunnel acoustics. But we both knew none of these explanations fit what we'd experienced. There was something fundamentally wrong about what we'd encountered in those tunnels, something that shouldn't exist in our world of logical explanations and natural laws. I did extensive research in the following weeks, looking for any similar experiences in the Shanghai Tunnels. I found a few vague references to strange music being heard in the early hours of the morning, and one account from the 1950s that mentioned a tall figure playing a fiddle, but nothing that matched exactly what we'd seen. Emma and I broke up a few months later. The experience had changed something between us. How do you go back to normal dating after sharing something like that? We still keep in touch, though we rarely talk about that night. Sometimes she'll call me late at night, usually after she's been drinking, and ask if I still remember the sound of that music. I always do. I haven't gone urban exploring since then. My cameras and lock-picking tools gather dust in a box in my closet. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself thinking about what else might be down there in those tunnels, moving through the darkness to the sound of that impossible music. A few weeks ago, I was walking home late from a friend's house when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A few notes of discordant violin music drifting on the wind. It was distant and faint, but I recognized it immediately. I ran all the way home and didn't sleep that night. I've never told this story publicly before. Part of me hopes that someone else might have experienced something similar and can help me make sense of what happened. But another part of me hopes that no one else has ever encountered what we did in those tunnels, because some things are better left undisturbed in the darkness where they belong. I still live in Portland, though I avoid the Old Town district now, especially at night. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed, I think I can hear that music again, floating up from somewhere deep underground. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I can hear something shuffling along with it, dragging itself through ancient tunnels, searching for something, or someone, in the darkness below the city. The rational part of my mind tells me that what we experienced that night must have a logical explanation. But deep down, I know better. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the forgotten places of our cities, things that should never be disturbed. So if you're an urban explorer, or just someone curious about the Shanghai Tunnels, take my advice, stick to the official tours. Some doors are meant to stay locked, some passages are meant to stay sealed, and some music is never meant to be heard by human ears. As for me, I've hung up my urban exploring gear for good. These days I prefer to keep to well-lit places where the only music I hear comes from street musicians and passing cars. But sometimes when the fog rolls in from the river and the city grows quiet, I find myself wondering about what's down there in those tunnels, still playing its otherworldly melody in the darkness, waiting for its next audience. Thanks so much for watching this creepy story. If you enjoyed it and want to hear more real-life scary encounters, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to turn on notifications by clicking the bell icon so you never miss an upload. Share your own creepy experiences in the comments below. I read every single one. See you in the next video, and remember, stay safe out there.